You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast series from the Conference Board, providing business leaders with trusted insights for what's ahead.
Welcome to this episode of C-Suite Perspectives, a new podcast series by the Conference Board. C-Suite Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, data-driven look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business executives. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best, which is to provide insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. Today's conversation will focus on sustainability, what the issue means, what are the top areas of concern, how businesses can do their part, and more. And I'm very excited to have join me today Dr. Uwe Schulte, the leader of our Global Sustainability Center at the Conference Board. Uwe's experience is, Uwe, you must have 50 years of experience in the sustainability field. Most of your time with Unilever throughout Europe and in the R&D function and supply chain. And I couldn't be more pleased to welcome you to the show, Uwe.
Thank you for having me.
So, Uwe, let's start with the basics. What does sustainability mean today?
Steve, there are so many definitions around there. There's a lot of confusion about this word, and I sometimes say it's the most abused word in a way. Yeah? But let me try to do it a little bit historically. As early as 1987, the Brundtland Commission, which was set in by the UN, came up with a general definition of sustainability, which I think is still valid today. It says, sustainable development is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. That's a pretty generic one, but a very, very good one, I think, in principle. But it doesn't help us when we look at corporate sustainability, but it puts it into perspective.
Yeah, the problem with that definition, though, is that it doesn't tell you who the stakeholders are, and it doesn't say what the scope of the work that they should be doing.
Yeah, exactly. It's too generic for us using it. But I thought, just to make the point that 1987 already people were having a very clear perspective on the need to define it. Now, we made a huge progress when the United Nations in 2015 came up with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I was very skeptical when they came out. 17, pretty complex and what have you. But at the end of the day, I think we can say in hindsight now, it has created a common language. So when I talk to people in Asia, when I talk to people in Europe, they all know about the UN SDGs, as we call them, and we all can relate to them. But again, these have been developed for countries, not for companies.
Yeah. But the good thing about it, as you said, is that it created the conversation and a framework so people could start with a common base, right?
Yeah, and what it did, it put an equal emphasis on environmental and social issues. Right. And that is something where people quite often get confused about sustainability to say it's all about environment. But sustainability is to sustain human life as well as possible. Yeah, so therefore it has to have social aspects.
Yeah, and I think at the broadest level, sustainability just means, look, we have scarce resources on this globe. Let's not soil them. Let's not use them up. Let's put them back. Let's leave the environment. Let's leave the globe in the condition that is better than we found it, and therefore ensure that the future generations of life, whether it's human or other, can survive and thrive. I think that's at its fundamental that why do we? Who would want to do damage? I guess that's the core question.
But I like the ambition of your definition right now, Steve, because you said leave it better than it was before.
Yes.
We're not quite there yet at the moment, I have to say. But anyway, it's about corporations that we as the Conference Board are trying to help. And we have come up with a report on business and society recently from a European perspective. But still, we talked about that sustainability has to be focusing around the long-term viability of a company and its impact on the well-being of all the stakeholders that are related to that company. And
I really think that Europe was so far ahead of other parts of the globe on this, and particularly Germany, which is fascinating. There were, and there's political overtones which I don't want to get into, but I think now you see a consensus arising, at least in the West, about the definitions and the need for all of this. So that is tremendous progress, Uwe, from where we all started. Yeah.
I must say I was very frustrated in the 80s and 90s because we really didn't get any traction. But I would say the last 10 years are more and more people, more and more corporations, more and more governments are getting the gist of it. The problem is that we have to have concerted efforts because the challenges ahead are pretty big.
Yeah, they are. So if I'm a business leader of small, large business, what should I think of as the top few areas of concern?
I think since the pandemic, a very prominent concern has become the well-being of human beings. That is something that's always been there, of course, but it's been more focus of attention and quite right so. And this starts, of course, with the citizens, but by implication, it has things to do for governments and business alike. So the question is, what do consumers want? And when you have seen the Fridays for Future movement, for example, you see that the younger generation is really concerned with how we deal with the resources the planet has got. But on the other hand, we have to be aware that consumers principally want affordable and safe products. That is something that is a fundamental need. But they are now increasingly asking, under which conditions have these products been produced? And they're not only talking about the environmental conditions, but also the social conditions. And that is something that more and more companies are taking care of and addressing. In a recent podcast, I was talking to the Chief Sustainability Officer of 3M, and they were explaining quite well how they address the concerns of the consumer and the customer, but at the same time are able to stay competitive.
Yeah, and this whole notion of stakeholderism, which is present in corporate governance and increasingly in the goals of most multinational companies, that we were trying to be there for our customers, for our employees, for our owners, for society, for the environment, and all of these are stakeholders, not just the shareholder. Of course, you can't forget the shareholder; they own the company, but at the same time, you have all of these other stakeholders, and it needs to become a balance and harmonized in a way. And so the well-being, as you said, I love the term that you use, well-being, the well-being of the employee and the well-being of the customer, and the harmonization of all activities such that it balances. It sounds a little Zen, doesn't it? But at the same time, this is what corporations really should be aspiring to.
Yeah, but at the same time, Steve, and we have to be aware of that as well, we live in an increasingly difficult world. Things are changing more rapidly. They're more volatile. They're more difficult to predict. And that means that companies have to become more agile, but also more resilient. And I know these words have been around for a while, and you can have different definitions. But in essence, what it says is you have to be able to address these issues. And there are issues that governments have to address, like if inequality gets too big, it becomes a point of destabilization of systems. If the healthcare isn't adequate, we have a problem. And companies can play a role in that. But if they play their role well, then they become more resilient and more agile, actually.
Yeah, it's sustainability used to refer mostly to environment, and we shouldn't forget that as we think also and append the social aspects of it. But the environment still, we didn't fix this yet, Uwe, and I'm waiting for you to fix it, but you haven't fixed it yet.
Yeah, and this is the story of my life, of course. I've been at it all the time, and it's a long time by now, and I haven't fixed it. I completely agree. But I remain an optimist. What I do believe is that we have to double and triple the efforts, that's for sure, but we can. And the amount of innovation I see coming from companies since they've put their mind to it be it on energy production, be it on making sure we'll have to talk about that as well. Plastic, for example, but we'll come to that. So people, companies are addressing these issues. We have good solutions, but we have to scale them. That's the problem. We haven't scaled them enough yet.
Yeah, and when you started, you mentioned the 80s, and of course, my early business career was in the 80s as well. And when we first started, we were talking about, environment, and we were talking about sustainability, mostly from, a standpoint of, it's okay. We should just be willing to increase our costs and lower our shareholder value creation because it's the right thing. But to me, I don't know if you agree with this, but to me, it was when we started talking about waste. And waste then going, not just waste from a landfill perspective or waste going,
Sure.
Back into the environment, but waste also then tied to cost. When all of a sudden it clicked, I think, for most business leaders. And, talk about that connection of waste from a, physical standpoint and waste from a cost standpoint.
I think this is an easy win when you think about it. Yeah, and it took quite a few companies quite a while to realize that running waste reduction. I remember having conversations that they said, we don't do anything for the environment. And I said, but you're running a program to reduce their energy usage. You're running a program to reduce your wastewater, and you're reducing your waste to landfill. That is all environmentally good stuff, and you can claim that. But that reduces our cost. So that in the mind of people was, if it reduces the cost, then we're not doing something good for the society. That's the biggest error you can make. What you have to do is you have to understand where is your biggest impact. And then you have to work on that impact. And in my experience, if you do this well, you either develop a lower cost or you develop a new business opportunity. So there is no contradiction between going more sustainable and having a thriving business.
Yeah, and in this point that you're making about, every industry is different, every company is different, but it's important to really evaluate your own situation and go back up through the supply chain. When I was CEO of Office Depot, we sold a lot of copier paper. We didn't produce anything. We didn't have paper mills and so forth, and we didn't pay a lot of attention to it. We bought it from the manufacturers. But then, people approached us and said, did you know that some of the paper is being produced with virgin forest land? And of course, we didn't know. But when that became known to us, we said, well, hey, wait a minute, stop. We have to get involved here. And we did. And we created a sustainable forestry program where the paper that we sourced was only from forests that were farmed and, in a sustainable fashion. But it's just one example. But every industry has an example like this of places that they can go and evaluate and really impact, their supply chain and the betterment of sustainability.
By the way, this is still a challenge. Even so, you thought you'd fixed it, but we still have illegal logging and stuff like this going on. But the good news is technology helps. Yeah, so we have satellite surveillance. I remember in my days, we had a similar issue in Indonesia, getting paper out of Indonesia for packaging, which was coming from unsustainable forestry. And we were trying to pull out. But actually, the Rainforest Alliance at the time said to me, please don't pull out. Go back there with a cloud of Unilever and do something about this changes. And as you did, we created programs around that. The biggest one was around sustainable palm as well, as you know.
Yeah, and it's just so important that everybody take their little slice of things and address what they can address. We've been talking to Dr. Uwe Schulte, who is the leader of the sustainability effort of the Conference Board, and we've talked about ways that businesses can improve sustainability in the top areas of concern. Next, we're going to dive deeper into some areas that are generating a lot of conversation, including plastics, one of my favorite subjects, recycling, composting, and global warming. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with more of my conversation with Uwe.
Interested in this content? You can find this and much more at our Conference Board website, www.conference-board.org. Or, even better, contact our membership team and your company can enjoy the benefits of our in-depth research around the economy, environmental, social, and governance issues, public policy, marketing and communications, and human capital. As a member of the conference board, you will be able to have full access to all of our cutting-edge research, leading indicators, benchmarking, and data services, in addition to webcasts and podcasts such as the one you are enjoying now.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by the leader of the Global Sustainability Center at the Conference Board, Dr. Uwe Schulte. Uwe, we've been talking about, the impact that companies can have on the environment and looking at their own supply chains and waste streams and so forth. I want to turn to plastics because you and I have spent a lot of time talking about this, and you can't turn on the news today without seeing these horrendous pictures of these floating islands of plastic, throughout the Pacific and the Atlantic. Talk to us about plastics and how is this happening and what should businesses be doing?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Plastic is top of mind. But let me just, it's my role to do this, say companies have to be aware of other areas of pollution, which can be, depending on the business they're in, be very, very important. Air pollution, water pollution in general. Right. There are other things as well. But let's focus on plastic here and now. And we did some work on the request of some members. And you, Steve, actually were very adamant in helping us doing that report. And we got experts from very different member companies giving us input into a report on plastic solid waste recycling. And that report has the big benefit of not taking sides on any of these different technologies and routes and so on and so forth. And that has been a great source of insight for me as well, working on that. I must say, I knew from my past, of course, some of the stuff, but it is very important. And
Uwe, how is this stuff getting to the oceans? I don't understand. So, the waste goes to the curb, as a household, or the equivalent as a business. It goes. I thought all this stuff, had a backstream on recycling. How is this ending up in the ocean?
It is, when you look at the numbers, it is actually very disappointing. We produce at the moment something like almost 400 million tons of plastic every year.
Wow.
Out of those 400 million, 50 million get recycled. And out of those 400 million, a lot is actually sort of not packaging and not single use. Therefore, it ends up in places where it has a longer lifetime, so it doesn't come into the stream. But we actually collect something like 170 million of that waste stream, and 80 million, we don't even know where it goes.
Okay, so let me just play this back, see if I have it. About 400 million tons a year is produced. We're recycling only about 10%, a little over 10%. We're collecting more than that, but then it's just disappearing. It's going. So that means that some people are bad actors in this, and they're dumping in the wrong places, doesn't it?
Yeah, what it means is that a lot still goes to landfill. Depending on the region you're in, the percentage of landfill is very different. Europe is sort of at least claiming to be a leader in recycling, but then the definition of recycling has to be very clear as well. And not everything that goes into a recycling plant is also being recycled. Some of the stuff is then burned, for example. So what I would say is the landfills, if they're organized landfills, are not the ideal solution, but at least something that I can live with because it's not going to end up in the ocean. But all the disorganized landfills and the dumping, that's what the issue is.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this is getting put on ships and barges to nominally go to recycling plants, which just accidentally get dumped in the ocean, and which is just it is maddening. But this is killing off our aquatic life, and it's damaging coral reefs. I mean, It's just awful on every dimension for the globe. And you might want to remark, because you're a scientist and you've been in R&D. I mean, how long does it take for plastic to degrade in the environment?
The point is, it actually doesn't degrade. The only thing that's happening, it's going to form microplastic, which eventually is going to end up in your own bloodstream. Yeah, so that's horrible. We have to get a grip on that. And what people have to understand is, some people say, okay, let's get rid of plastic. sorry for being very outspoken about this. This is nonsense. We cannot get rid of plastic. There are many very important roles of plastic in medical supplies, keeping things sterile, making sure that food gets actually uncontaminated to where it has to be. We have it in cars, for example, lightweighting cars and therefore consuming less fuel and what have you. So it's not going to go away. So therefore, we have to start to manage these streams. And there was a big negligence by all players over the last 30, 40 years, not paying attention to what was happening. And Steve, our China Center has written a report about it. We were putting a lot of this and shipped it to China for recycling. And then the Chinese said, we don't want this stuff anymore. Yeah? And that has, among other things, highlighted that these streams have to be organized and managed in a different way. The good news is there's a lot of technology being developed. There's a lot of innovative thinking from companies there. And we have ways of getting a grip on that. But when you said to me, where does all this ocean stuff come from? One is it's in some major rivers around the world are actually floating this stuff into the ocean. And it maddens me to think about that is stoppable. We can stop that. Yeah. And that has to be a priority. And we have to just started with an ocean conservation NGO, a corporation, to look into that and give some business insights on how things can be done there.
Yeah, I think, and you raised some really important points. I mean, both of us, spent time in the food industry. I grew up in the food industry and still am there today. And plastics are very important. I mean, food pathogens kill people all over the world, and so, and of course in the medical field. But it doesn't really break down, as you said. So there are new technologies that scientists are developing, which are bioplastics, which essentially are made with plant materials that do break down. Talk about the future of plastics, and will that technology then solve the problem?
I'm afraid not. But I think we have solutions for the problem. So the good news is we have solutions to the problem. The bad news is it's not going to be a biodegradation of plastic. What we have to do is the first thing has to be avoid plastic where we can. So, single-use plastic, silly stuff out of plastic which can easily be replaced, that has to go. The second thing has to be that we replace it where we can replace it. But there are dangers in doing that. To give you an example, replacing plastic by glass is very often not a good idea because you have heavier weight and all the implications. And actually the recycling of glass is quite energy intensive as well. So the other thing that we have to do is to get a lot better at recycling. And the key thing is to manage the streams of the plastic waste better. But I have some good news for you. I've recently spoken to a guy from a medium-sized company. I think they have $1 billion or something like this revenue. And they are now providing, for example, the car industry with polypropylene plastic parts, really high-quality polypropylene plastic parts in the quality the car industry, and they are wanting, fully from post-consumer recycled polypropylene.
So basically, they're taking polypropylene, recycling it, and then refashioning it into parts. So what you're saying is that's a virtuous loop then, and it's not going to waste.
Yeah, and the thing is, the challenge here is that you manage that stream. Yeah, so collecting, sorting, cleaning, recycling. Yeah. So, but what I'm saying is, here is a commercial enterprise that has now done this completely in a way that they make profit out of it. Yeah, so
and that's the
good news. Now, but back to your composting question, Steve, very, very briefly. A lot of confusion around bioplastic. There are two types of bioplastic. One is making normal plastic like polyethylene or something like this out of plant material. That doesn't solve the waste problem because that doesn't biodegrade either. Or you make plastic out of plant material that can biodegrade and can be composted. That's great, and there are some solutions, and people are developing it. And yes, it will solve some problems, but it is a niche solution. Why? Because there are two issues with that. One, that plastic material has certain properties that many plastic applications can't deal with. And the second thing is, and that has to do with the inherent point, you putting breakable bonds into the plastic, that of course influences the properties. And secondly, the plastic needs to be in a very single stream to be composted under industrial conditions. If there's something else in there, it can't be composted anymore. Therefore, we need a single stream for that.
Yeah. So basically, it's not a panacea, because it doesn't create, a tough enough product for all applications, but it's worthy of chasing. And I'm just so happy, Uwe, that you did not take our listeners through the chemical formulae and the bonds that would need to be. I'm teasing him, because he could actually do this for us if we asked him. But in our time left, we can't talk about sustainability without mentioning global warming and what is going on there. And there's just so much misinformation, and people think it's a settled science. It's there's no such thing as settled science, and we're learning more all the time. But this is a very complex subject. There are sun cycles that come in. There's water vapor, which creates an enormous amount of warming. Of course, CO2 in the atmosphere, and most CO2 is retained by oceans, and that's being released. How should we be thinking about global warming? Is it something that are we just tilting at windmills here, or can we actually influence it?
Yeah, look, the time left doesn't do it justice. What I would say is, I've recently found a nice blog by the NASA climate blog. They address all these questions you've just raised. Let me just do it very quickly. So there was a lot of debate whether there is global warming or not. That's gone. We know it's there now. Then the question is, who is causing it? Again, a debate that I don't even want to enter. The fact that it's happening is there, and we see it increasingly with extreme weather events everywhere. And therefore, whatever happens for companies, you have to be aware of two things. One, this is happening, so you have to be prepared on the consequences of these extreme weather events. So whatever you do, you have to look very carefully at what that means, what climate change means for you. That's one thing. The other thing is the sun influencing it? Absolutely. The sun is influencing the weather. That's for sure. But over the last 50 years, the sun activities have gone down. And therefore, the global warming that we are experiencing can't be correlated to that. Now, some people say, but this is the sign that we go into an ice age. Now, the thing is, the reduction that will come from the sun is in the order of maximum less than half a degree. And we've already managed more than 1 degree with what we've done. So whatever the sun does, it will not solve our problem. On the ocean, I have bad news for you, Steve. What we're doing is, the ocean is the biggest sink of carbon dioxide. It takes 90% of the carbon dioxide, but it's getting saturated, and it's getting, because of the carbon dioxide, which forms then carbonic acid in the sea, makes it more acid. That's why the coral reefs are disappearing. And therefore, we've pushed it to a limit. So what I'm saying is, as a company, do two things. One, prepare yourself for these extreme weather events. And that's drought as much as flooding and tornadoes and what have you. And secondly, be aware what your impact is, because all these things will increase the carbon price, and that carbon price will have a market effect on you. And therefore, you have to look into what these future scenarios of carbon pricing are going to do to you. I would love to spend more time on that, but
please let's come back and let's do more on this, because I think that we're all in one globe. We spin through the same atmosphere. We share the same resources, and we have to come together across the nations and do more here, because as you said, there are exogenous forces we don't control. There's stuff coming from space, but at the same time, why not control what we can control? Why exactly not stop the emissions that we are emitting into the atmosphere, and stop polluting our own home? And I think that's what it comes back to. Uwe Schulte, Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been fascinating. And thank you to all of you for listening to C-Suite Perspectives. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by a new business leader or thought leader on a different topic, and we'll be talking about a variety of issues from public policy to environmental, social, and governance, marketing, communications, you name it, we will cover it. Please share C-Suite Perspectives with your friends. Thanks for joining us. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You've been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast series from the Conference Board that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead to the nation's business leaders. Find this podcast and others from the Conference Board wherever you find your podcasts.